The explosion over Lockerbie ended a flight in seconds. The investigation that followed would last decades. Thousands of fragments were collected, thousands of pages were written, and yet some questions never found a place in the final record. This is not a story about a missing answer. It is a story about how an investigation reaches its limit. On the night of December 21st, 1988, the sky above Scotland was calm. Commercial air traffic moved as scheduled. Weather conditions were unremarkable. There was nothing to suggest that one routine flight would fracture international certainty for decades. Pan American World Airways Flight 103 departed London bound for New York. It carried passengers from multiple countries. Families returning home for the holidays, students, business travelers, crew members following standard procedure. Nothing about the flight appeared exceptional. Less than an hour later, the aircraft ceased to exist. At 31,000 feet above the town of Lockerbie, a powerful explosion tore through the fuselage. The plane disintegrated mid-air. Debris fell across miles of countryside. The wreckage did not land in one place. It scattered. Homes were destroyed, fires ignited, entire sections of the aircraft were found far from one another. All 259 people on board were killed. 11 residents of Lockerbie died on the ground. Within minutes, it was clear this was not an accident. The pattern of destruction indicated an internal blast. A violent rupture from within the aircraft. The assumption was immediate. This was terrorism. Emergency services arrived to a scene unlike anything Britain had faced before. Local responders were overwhelmed, military units were deployed, the area became a vast, uncontrolled crime scene. From the beginning, the scale of the disaster dictated the investigation. This was not simply an aviation incident. It was a mass casualty crime involving multiple jurisdictions, governments, and intelligence agencies. Every piece of wreckage became potential evidence. Every fragment of metal, fabric, and wiring was catalogued, photographed, and collected. The terrain itself became part of the investigation. Fields, roads, residential areas. Evidence was recovered from rooftops, gardens, and open land. The operation grew rapidly. Thousands of personnel were involved. Investigators worked in rotating shifts. The process of reconstruction began almost immediately. The goal was unprecedented: to reassemble the aircraft from fragments, to understand exactly how the explosion occurred, where it originated, what caused it. This effort would take years. From the outset, the investigation was international. British authorities led the recovery. American agencies joined almost immediately. Other governments monitored developments closely. The pressure to identify responsibility was immense. This was the deadliest terrorist attack involving an American airline at the time. The geopolitical context mattered. The late 1980s were defined by tension, retaliation, and unresolved conflict. Acts of terror were rarely isolated. They carried implications far beyond the event itself. From the beginning, there was an expectation that responsibility would be assigned. Not just determined, assigned. As the wreckage was gathered, early conclusions began to form. The explosion appeared to have originated in the cargo hold. Investigators focused on luggage, on containers, on anything that could conceal an explosive device. The reconstruction of the aircraft was painstaking. Piece by piece, fragments were laid out in hangars. Sections of fuselage were aligned, damage patterns were studied. This process was presented as methodical and precise, and in many ways it was. But it was also vulnerable. A crime scene spread across miles is difficult to control. Chain of custody becomes complex. Documentation must be flawless. Every transfer of evidence introduces risk. The larger the operation, the harder it becomes to maintain absolute certainty. As months passed, investigators announced progress. Fragments believed to be part of an explosive device were identified. Attention focused on components that could survive a blast. Electronics, timer parts, fragments of casing. Each discovery narrowed the narrative. The explosion was not random. It was constructed. The bomb had been placed deliberately. The investigation now shifted toward origin. Where did the device enter the aircraft? How was it concealed? Who had access? This phase required cooperation across borders. Airports were scrutinized, security protocols examined, baggage handling procedures reviewed. Every potential weakness became significant. This was not only about solving a crime, it was about preventing repetition. Public statements emphasized confidence. Authorities spoke of progress, of clarity emerging. Behind the scenes, the complexity deepened. Evidence passed through multiple hands. Different agencies applied different standards. Documentation varied by jurisdiction. This complexity did not imply misconduct. It implied strain. The Lockerbie investigation was unlike anything before it. It required coordination without precedent. As the years passed, focus intensified around specific items. A fragment of a circuit board, pieces of clothing believed to be associated with the device, connections traced through manufacturing records. These elements formed the backbone of the emerging case. They were presented as stable, as the foundation upon which conclusions would rest. The narrative began to solidify. Responsibility was traced beyond the aircraft, beyond the airport, toward individuals, toward a state. This shift marked a turning point. The investigation was no longer simply forensic, it was political. Accusations carried diplomatic consequences. Evidence carried strategic weight. From this point on, the integrity of every piece of evidence mattered more than ever, not only because it would be scrutinized in court, but because it would shape international relations, sanctions, negotiations, public positioning. The Lockerbie case was no longer contained within the realm of criminal justice. It existed at the intersection of law, politics, and power. The investigation continued. Years passed. The public was periodically updated. Confidence was reiterated. But as the case moved closer to formal accusation, questions emerged. Not publicly at first, internally. Questions about timelines, about documentation, about consistency. These questions did not suggest fabrication, they suggested fragility. The kind of fragility that emerges when evidence is handled repeatedly over long periods, when fragments change hands, when records are revised, when memory replaces immediate observation. The Lockerbie investigation relied on reconstruction. Reconstruction is not the same as observation. It depends on interpretation. Interpretation depends on assumption, and assumption is shaped by context. As the political context hardened, so did the narrative. Certain explanations gained prominence, others receded. This was not necessarily manipulation, it was prioritization. Investigations, especially large ones, cannot pursue every possibility indefinitely. They narrow, they focus, they commit. That commitment carries risk. If early assumptions are incorrect, later conclusions inherit those errors. This is not failure, it is structural vulnerability. The Lockerbie investigation was built on unprecedented effort. But effort alone does not guarantee clarity. The sheer scale of the operation created its own challenges. Thousands of fragments, millions of data points, years of accumulation. At a certain point, the investigation became as much about managing information as uncovering it. What to emphasize, what to discard, what to consider resolved. These decisions shape outcomes. By the early 1990s, the case had crystallized. Specific individuals were named. A narrative was presented. The investigation had reached a stage where it needed to move forward, to court, to judgment, to closure. Yet beneath the surface, not everything aligned perfectly. Some elements remained ambiguous, some documentation raised questions. Not enough to halt progress, enough to linger. These lingering uncertainties did not stop the case. They followed it, quietly, in the background. The night of December 21st had created an obligation to the victims, to their families, to the public. That obligation was to deliver justice. Justice requires answers. But answers, once delivered, carry permanence. The Lockerbie investigation was approaching that moment, where the narrative would harden into record, where evidence would be fixed into legal history, where questions would either be addressed or archived. This chapter does not dispute the crime. It does not dispute the tragedy. It establishes the environment in which the investigation unfolded. An environment defined by scale, pressure, and consequence. From the beginning, the Lockerbie case demanded certainty. But certainty is difficult to sustain when an investigation spans continents, years, and political realities. The first phase was about reconstruction. The second would be about interpretation. And what happened to evidence in that transition would shape everything that followed. Because in cases of this magnitude, evidence does not simply exist, it moves. It changes hands, it is recontextualized, it becomes symbolic. And once evidence becomes symbolic, its treatment becomes inseparable from the outcome it is meant to support. The explosion over Lockerbie ended a flight. It began an investigation that would never truly end. The next chapter begins when that investigation expands beyond wreckage and into narrative, when the question shifts from how the plane was destroyed to how the story of its destruction would be constructed. And when the first signs appear that not everything collected would remain exactly as it was found. The investigation that followed the Lockerbie explosion did not remain contained within Scotland for long. It expanded outward, driven by necessity and expectation. British authorities coordinated recovery on the ground. American agencies arrived with technical expertise and political urgency. International partners offered intelligence, access, and pressure. This was not a single investigation. It was many investigations moving in parallel. Each agency brought its own priorities, its own standards, its own assumptions. Coordination became essential and difficult. From the outset, the case demanded speed. Public confidence required reassurance. Families demanded answers. Governments demanded accountability. Speed and precision were expected simultaneously. This tension shaped the investigation's structure. Early conclusions pointed toward a bomb concealed in checked baggage. The focus narrowed to airport security, luggage transfer, and passenger routing. Attention shifted away from the sky and toward the ground. Where did the device enter the system? Which airport allowed it through? Who had access? Answering these questions required international cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Airports across Europe were scrutinized, records were requested, security protocols reviewed. Investigators reconstructed baggage movements from handwritten logs, partial manifests, and memory. This process was inherently imperfect. Air travel infrastructure in the late 1980s was not designed for forensic reconstruction. Records were incomplete, procedures varied, technology was limited. Investigators filled gaps as best they could. As months passed, the investigation accumulated material, physical evidence from the wreckage, documentation from airlines, statements from airport staff, intelligence assessments from multiple governments. This accumulation created momentum. Momentum can be mistaken for clarity. As the archive grew, the narrative began to take shape. Investigators identified fragments believed to be part of an explosive device. Attention focused on components that could survive detonation. Circuit boards, timer fragments, pieces of metal casing. These items were treated as anchors, stable points around which the story could be built. They were catalogued, photographed, and transferred between agencies for analysis. Each transfer introduced complexity. Chain of custody procedures were documented, but documentation varied. Different agencies recorded details differently. Standards were not uniform. This was not unusual, but in a case of this magnitude, small discrepancies carried weight. The investigation's international character magnified every inconsistency. What one agency considered routine, another treated as critical. As the narrative narrowed, political context intensified. The late 1980s were marked by unresolved geopolitical tensions. Acts of terror were rarely isolated. They were interpreted through the lens of state conflict. The Lockerbie case did not escape this lens. Intelligence assessments began to intersect with forensic conclusions. This intersection changed the tone of the investigation. Evidence was no longer just evidence. It became implication. Statements were measured. Public messaging became careful. The investigation's findings would not only determine guilt, they would influence diplomacy, sanctions, negotiations, international posture. This reality shaped decision-making. As years passed, investigators identified suspects. Names were associated with states. Responsibility was framed in terms of sponsorship rather than isolation. The case moved from criminal inquiry toward geopolitical assertion. This transition was gradual. It did not occur through a single decision. It emerged through emphasis. Certain leads were prioritized, others received less attention. This was not necessarily suppression, it was selection. Investigations of this scale cannot pursue every possibility indefinitely. They must choose. The choices made in the Lockerbie case reflected the pressures surrounding it. Evidence that aligned with emerging conclusions gained prominence. Evidence that complicated them became secondary. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about structure. As the investigation progressed, the volume of material became both asset and obstacle. Thousands of items were logged, millions of pages generated. Managing this information required systems. Those systems introduced hierarchy. What mattered most rose to the top. What mattered less remained buried. The archive grew heavy. With weight came inertia. Changing direction became increasingly difficult. Once a narrative solidifies, reversing course requires overwhelming justification. The Lockerbie investigation reached that stage quietly. By the early 1990s, the case had an established direction. Evidence was interpreted through that frame. New findings were evaluated in relation to it. This is how investigations stabilize. Stability allows movement toward prosecution. But stability can also limit reconsideration. Behind the scenes, concerns surfaced. Questions about timelines, questions about documentation, questions about the handling of specific items. These questions were not ignored, they were addressed internally. But addressing a question is not the same as resolving it. Some issues remained ambiguous. Ambiguity does not stop an investigation. It becomes part of its background noise. The focus remained on assembling a case strong enough to proceed. Strength was defined legally, not epistemologically. What could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, not what could be known with absolute certainty. This distinction mattered. The Lockerbie investigation was not searching for truth in the abstract. It was preparing for trial. Trials require coherence, they require narrative, they require evidence that aligns. Incoherence is addressed through exclusion. Evidence that complicates the story may be deemed irrelevant, or insufficient, or unreliable. This process is legal, it is not conspiratorial, but it shapes the record. As the case moved closer to formal charges, the investigation's scope narrowed further. Peripheral leads were closed, alternative scenarios deprioritized. The archive retained them, but the narrative did not. This narrowing created confidence. Public statements emphasized progress. Officials spoke of clarity, of accountability approaching. Yet within the archive, not everything was settled. Some evidence remained difficult to contextualize. Some documentation raised questions about sequence and handling. These issues did not stop the case. They were absorbed. Absorption is a form of resolution. The investigation's international nature added another layer of complexity. Evidence crossed borders. Jurisdictions overlapped. Legal standards differed. What was admissible in one court might be challenged in another. This reality required coordination not just in investigation, but in presentation. The story had to be consistent across systems. Consistency became a goal. Consistency favors simplification. By the time formal accusations were announced, the Lockerbie investigation had transformed. It began as a forensic response to an unprecedented disaster. It became a managed process aimed at delivering a judicial outcome. This transformation was not hidden, it was institutional. The shift from inquiry to prosecution is normal, but in cases where evidence is fragile, that shift carries consequences. Once prosecution becomes the objective, evidence is evaluated through that lens. Questions that threaten coherence are addressed differently. They are resolved procedurally rather than substantively. The investigation continued. Years passed. Public attention fluctuated. Behind the scenes, the archive grew more rigid. Earlier decisions became foundations. Foundations are difficult to disturb. The Lockerbie investigation now existed within a defined structure. Its boundaries were set. What lay outside those boundaries remained recorded, but inactive. This was not neglect, it was focus. Focus has cost. As the case moved toward trial, the need for certainty intensified. Certainty does not tolerate ambiguity easily. Ambiguity must be managed. In this case, management took the form of selection. What evidence would speak? What evidence would remain silent? The second chapter of this story is not about disappearance. Not yet. It is about convergence, about how a vast, chaotic investigation begins to narrow, how complexity gives way to narrative, how pressure shapes direction, and how, in the process, certain questions begin to lose their voice. The Lockerbie investigation did not fail in this phase. It functioned as designed. But design is not neutral. It reflects priorities. And those priorities would determine what survived into court and what would remain behind, archived but unresolved. The next chapter begins where convergence turns into fragility, where the handling of evidence itself becomes part of the story, where not everything collected remains equally present, and where disappearance does not always mean removal. Sometimes it means something quieter, a shift in emphasis, a change in status, a piece of evidence that remains on record but no longer matters. By the time the Lockerbie investigation entered the courtroom phase, the evidence had already lived many lives. It had been recovered from fields and rooftops, catalogued in temporary facilities, transferred between agencies, analysed, reanalyzed, and interpreted through evolving assumptions. What arrived in court was not the crime scene itself, it was a version of it. At the centre of the case were a small number of items elevated above all others. Fragments identified as parts of a timer, pieces of circuit board, clothing remnants believed to be associated with the explosive device. These objects became decisive. They carried the weight of attribution. They linked the destruction of an aircraft to a specific mechanism, a specific origin, and ultimately, specific individuals. The entire case narrowed around them. This narrowing created focus. It also created vulnerability, because when a case depends heavily on a limited set of physical items, the integrity of those items becomes absolute. Their documentation, their handling, their history, any uncertainty in that history matters, not symbolically, legally. As scrutiny intensified, questions emerged, not about the existence of the evidence, but about its journey. Where exactly was it found? Who handled it first? How was it stored? When was it transferred? These questions were not abstract. They appeared in records, dates that did not align perfectly, descriptions that changed slightly over time, gaps where documentation should have been routine. None of this was dramatic, it was procedural, and that is precisely why it mattered. In complex investigations, procedural consistency is the foundation of credibility. The Lockerbie case stretched that foundation across years, agencies, and borders. One fragment in particular would come to define the controversy. A piece of circuit board, identified as part of a timing device. This fragment was small, its significance was enormous. It connected the explosion to a specific type of timer. That timer was linked to a specific supplier. That supplier connected the chain outward, from component to manufacturer, from manufacturer to purchaser, from purchaser to suspect. The logic was linear, the reliance was total. As the case progressed, this fragment was referenced repeatedly, in reports, in testimony, in summaries. Its status hardened. It became less an object and more a conclusion. But conclusions require stability, and stability requires consistency. Over time, questions were raised about how and when this fragment was recovered. Early reports placed it in one context, later descriptions adjusted that context. The differences were subtle, but subtlety does not negate importance. In forensic cases, small shifts can alter interpretation. The defense focused on these inconsistencies. They questioned timelines, they examined documentation, they highlighted changes in description. The prosecution responded by emphasizing the broader coherence of the case. Minor discrepancies were framed as inevitable in large-scale investigations. The evidence, they argued, remained fundamentally sound. This exchange revealed a deeper tension. The Lockerbie case was not built on a single, uninterrupted chain. It was built on convergence, multiple strands brought together over time. Convergence is persuasive, but it is also interpretive. It depends on the alignment of assumptions. Another area of concern involved clothing fragments. Items believed to have been associated with the explosive device were traced to a specific source: a shop, a location, a transaction. This linkage was crucial. It grounded the abstract mechanics of the bomb in a physical place. But this too raised questions. Witness recollections changed over time. Descriptions became more specific years after the fact. Memory is not static. It reshapes itself, especially under repetition, especially when reinforced by expectation. The investigation relied heavily on retrospective identification. Witnesses were asked to recall details long after the event. The passage of time altered the reliability of those recollections. This was acknowledged. But acknowledgement did not dissolve dependency. The case needed these connections to hold. As scrutiny increased, concerns extended beyond individual items. They reached into process, how evidence was prioritized, how conflicting information was reconciled, how uncertainty was managed. Some material that initially appeared relevant was later deprioritized, not removed, reclassified. This distinction is important. Evidence does not always disappear physically. Sometimes it disappears functionally. It remains in the archive but loses influence. Its relevance diminishes. It is no longer cited, no longer emphasized, no longer part of the narrative. This process is rarely announced. It happens through focus, through repetition, through omission. Over time, certain elements of the Lockerbie investigation became central. Others faded. This did not require intent. It required momentum. Once a case moves toward trial, coherence becomes paramount. Evidence that complicates coherence is difficult to accommodate. It does not vanish. It becomes background. The court case formalized this hierarchy. What was admissible mattered. What could be explained succinctly mattered. Complexity was trimmed. The story was streamlined. This is not unusual. Courts are not archives. They are instruments of judgment. They require clarity. But clarity often demands reduction. The reduction of the Lockerbie case had consequences. Elements that raised questions about handling, timing, or consistency remained documented. They were not erased, but they were not decisive. After the trial, attention shifted again, from proof to outcome. A verdict had been reached. The case was considered legally resolved. Legal resolution carries authority. It transforms interpretation. Questions that once felt urgent now appear settled. The narrative hardens. Re-examination becomes difficult. Yet outside the courtroom, discussion did not end. Observers continued to examine the record. Journalists reviewed transcripts. Legal scholars analyzed procedures. Families of victims asked questions. Some focused on the same issues raised during trial: chain of custody, witness reliability, documentation gaps. Others identified new concerns: inconsistencies between early and later reports, discrepancies in official summaries. These discussions did not alter the verdict, but they altered perception. The case began to exist in two forms: the legal form and the archival form. The legal form was fixed. The archival form remained fluid. Within the archive, evidence does not disappear, it accumulates. New interpretations sit alongside old ones. Contradictions are preserved rather than resolved. This preservation creates tension. Over time, some evidence appears less stable than once believed, not because it was fabricated, but because its context shifted. What was once decisive becomes debatable. What was once peripheral gains attention. This is the nature of long-lived cases. They age. The Lockerbie investigation aged rapidly. As years passed, official confidence remained, but quiet reassessments occurred. Internal reviews, appeals, independent examinations. These processes did not overturn the outcome, but they exposed fragility. Fragility in the handling of key items, fragility in documentation, fragility in memory. The term disappearance does not always describe physical loss. In this case, it describes something else: the gradual loss of certainty, the fading of evidentiary solidity, the transformation of objects into symbols rather than anchors. Evidence that once spoke clearly now required interpretation to be heard at all. The archive recorded this transformation. It did not resolve it. Some materials remained inaccessible, classified, restricted, unreleased. Their absence created space. Space for doubt, space for speculation, but also space for restraint. The investigation had concluded legally. Reopening questions carried risk to institutional credibility, risk to diplomatic stability, risk to finality. Finality became a priority. As a result, unresolved evidentiary issues remained unresolved. Not hidden, contained. Contained within files, contained within footnotes, contained within language that acknowledged complexity without revisiting it. The third chapter of this story is not about accusation. It is about process, about how evidence behaves over time, how it shifts in meaning, how it gains and loses influence. In the Lockerbie case, evidence did not vanish overnight. It was collected meticulously. But its significance changed. Some items rose, others fell. Some remained visible, others receded into the archive. This is how investigations evolve, not through dramatic erasure, through quiet selection. By the time the case was formally concluded, the evidence that mattered most was no longer simply physical. It was institutional. It was embedded in verdicts, reports, and official language. To challenge it required more than counter-evidence. It required reopening history. The investigation did not choose to do that. Instead, it moved forward, leaving behind an archive that still holds unresolved questions. Questions about how evidence was handled, how it was emphasized, how it was interpreted. Questions that were never fully answered because answering them was no longer the objective. The next chapter begins where evidence stops being examined and starts being managed, where the case transitions from investigation to conclusion, and where disappearance becomes not a matter of loss, but of decision. Because in some cases, evidence does not disappear from the record, it disappears from relevance. And once relevance is gone, the truth it might support becomes much harder to reach. When the Lockerbie case reached its conclusion, it did so without the feeling of completion. Legally, the matter had been decided. Institutionally, it had been contained. But investigatively, it had not arrived anywhere final. The verdict created closure of a specific kind. Not closure rooted in total certainty, closure rooted in procedure. Once the court delivered its judgment, the investigation entered a different phase. Not inquiry, management. The focus shifted from examining evidence to preserving the outcome. Appeals were filed, reviews were conducted. Independent assessments were commissioned. Each process reaffirmed the same boundary. The verdict would stand unless something extraordinary emerged. Extraordinary did not mean questionable, it meant undeniable. This threshold was nearly impossible to reach. The archive by this point was immense. Thousands of documents, years of correspondence, technical reports layered over one another. The weight of the archive itself became a barrier. To challenge the case required confronting not a single decision, but an entire structure. Evidence that had once been contested was now embedded in precedent. Legal precedent carries gravity. It transforms interpretation into fact. What was once debated becomes established. Questions that remain are reframed as disagreements rather than deficiencies. This reframing altered how concerns were addressed. When critics pointed to inconsistencies, officials responded with reference to process. The investigation had been thorough, the trial had been fair, the appeals had been heard, the system had functioned. This response did not deny the presence of ambiguity, it neutralized it. Ambiguity was acknowledged but rendered irrelevant. The case was no longer about what might be true, it was about what could be changed. And nothing, it seemed, could be. Over time, families of victims expressed frustration, not only with the outcome, but with the opacity. Requests for additional disclosure were made. Some documents remained classified. Others were released in heavily redacted form. The reasons given were familiar: national security, ongoing sensitivity, international relations. These explanations were procedural. They did not engage with the substance of concern. They reaffirmed boundaries. The disappearance at the center of this story did not occur in one moment. It unfolded gradually. Evidence was not destroyed, it was restricted. Access narrowed, visibility decreased. What had once been actively examined was now passively stored. The archive shifted from active to inert. Inert does not mean empty, it means untouched. As years passed, independent investigators and journalists revisited the case. They examined trial transcripts. They compared early reports with later summaries. They identified discrepancies in how evidence was described. These efforts produced discussion. They did not produce action. The official position remained unchanged. The case had been decided. Reopening it would require more than questions. It would require institutional willingness. That willingness did not materialize. At this stage, the Lockerbie investigation functioned less as a search for truth and more as a symbol of resolution, a symbol that said the system had responded, that accountability had been established, that justice had been delivered. Symbols are powerful. They discourage reconsideration. Challenging a symbol threatens stability. Stability became a priority. This priority shaped how remaining evidence was treated. Some material remained unavailable to the public. Other material was released selectively. Release did not equal transparency. Context was limited. Interpretation was guided. The archive was curated. Curation is not falsification, it is selection. Selection determines narrative. The narrative of the Lockerbie case became fixed, a bomb, a mechanism, a chain of responsibility. Elements that complicated this narrative remained present but marginal. They existed in footnotes, in dissenting opinions, in supplementary material, not in the conclusion. The conclusion had been reached. This created a paradox. The investigation was over, but debate continued. The case was closed, but discussion persisted. The system responded by drawing firmer lines. No further inquiry, no reopening. The archive would remain, but its interpretation would not change. This stance was justified as finality. Finality is comforting. It provides an endpoint. But finality without certainty creates tension. That tension was managed through language. Officials spoke of balance, of responsibility, of the need to move forward. Moving forward required leaving questions behind. Those questions did not disappear. They remained documented. But documentation alone does not sustain relevance. Relevance requires engagement. Engagement was withdrawn. The Lockerbie case entered its dormant phase. Not forgotten, not erased, dormant. In dormancy, evidence does not vanish, it waits. But waiting without access is indistinguishable from disappearance. For those outside the system, the distinction matters little. What cannot be examined cannot be resolved. What cannot be resolved cannot challenge the record. The record remains intact. Over time, institutional memory faded. Personnel changed. Decision-makers retired. New priorities emerged. The case became historical. Historical cases are treated differently. They are referenced rather than revisited. They inform policy rather than provoke inquiry. This transformation altered the stakes. The Lockerbie investigation was no longer about accountability. It was about legacy. Legacy favors coherence. It favors narratives that hold. Inconsistencies are acknowledged but absorbed. They do not destabilize. The fourth chapter ends here, at the point where the investigation ceases to function as an investigation, where evidence ceases to be examined and begins to be preserved, where questions remain but no longer demand response. The disappearance this episode examines is not a single missing item. It is the disappearance of possibility. The possibility that evidence could still speak differently, that the archive could still change meaning, that the conclusion could still shift. Once that possibility vanished, the investigation effectively ended. Not with a revelation, but with a decision. A decision to stop asking. The final chapter turns to what remains after that decision. What the archive holds, what it omits, and what it means when an investigation ends not because the truth has been exhausted, but because the process has reached its limit. Because some cases are not finished by answers. They are finished by time. When the Lockerbie investigation finally settled into history, it did not do so with clarity. It settled with weight. The weight of files, the weight of decisions, the weight of conclusions that could no longer be challenged without reopening an entire era. The archive remained. Thousands of documents preserved the effort, the intent, and the process. They also preserved contradiction. What the archive did not preserve was momentum. Once the case was formally resolved, attention moved elsewhere. Institutions shifted focus. Resources were reassigned. The investigation had reached its end, not because every question had been answered, but because the system had determined that no further answers could be operationally pursued. This distinction defines the final state of the Lockerbie case. Not solved, not disproven, concluded. Conclusion is not the same as truth. Conclusion is administrative. It draws a line. Beyond that line, inquiry becomes destabilizing rather than productive. This logic shaped what followed. Calls for further disclosure were met with restraint. Requests for access encountered limitation. The archive became guarded. Guarding was justified as protection of sensitive information, protection of diplomatic relationships, protection of institutional integrity. Each justification was procedural, none addressed substance. As time passed, the idea of reopening the investigation became increasingly abstract. Who would lead it? Under what authority? With what evidence? The people who had handled the original material were gone. Memories had faded, context had shifted. Reopening the case would not restore the moment when evidence was fresh. It would only re-expose uncertainty. Uncertainty was no longer acceptable. The disappearance at the heart of this story was now complete. Not a sudden loss, a gradual withdrawal. Evidence that once held potential was now locked into interpretation. Documents that once invited scrutiny were now referenced selectively. Questions that once mattered were now described as historical. This is how investigations end, when truth remains incomplete. They do not collapse, they ossify. The Lockerbie case became fixed in its final form. The verdict remained. The narrative held. The archive stopped moving. From the outside, the case appeared resolved. From within the record, tension remained. The archive contains traces of unresolved paths, leads that were deprioritized, inconsistencies that were acknowledged but not pursued, materials that were never fully examined publicly. These traces do not prove an alternative conclusion, they prove incompleteness. Incompleteness is uncomfortable. Institutions are not designed to exist comfortably with it. They prefer closure. Closure restores order. It allows systems to move forward. But closure without full certainty leaves residue. That residue becomes part of history. The families of those who died carried this residue longest. For them, the case was never abstract. It was personal. They asked not for speculation, but for transparency. They asked how evidence had been handled, why some material remained inaccessible, why inconsistencies persisted without resolution. These questions did not disappear. They were acknowledged. Acknowledgement did not lead to reopening. Over time, acknowledgement became ritual. Statements were repeated, positions reaffirmed, nothing changed. The Lockerbie investigation became an example, not only of international cooperation, not only of forensic ambition, but of how large systems conclude when certainty remains out of reach. The system did not deny the presence of unanswered questions. It contained them. Containment is a strategy. It allows unresolved elements to exist without threatening the overall structure. The archive plays a central role in this strategy. By preserving everything, it creates the appearance of completeness. By limiting access and interpretation, it controls meaning. The archive does not lie, it withholds. Withholding is quieter than denial. It is harder to confront. Years later, discussions of Lockerbie often begin and end with the same phrases. The case was investigated thoroughly. The trial was conducted fairly. The matter was resolved. These statements are institutionally accurate. They are also incomplete. They describe process, not certainty. They describe outcome, not understanding. The final truth of the Lockerbie investigation is not found in a single document. It exists in the gap between effort and clarity, between reconstruction and interpretation, between evidence collected and evidence understood. The disappearance referenced in this story is not limited to a fragment, a document, or a record. It is the disappearance of possibility. The possibility that the investigation could still evolve, that evidence could still be reweighted, that conclusions could still shift. Once that possibility vanished, the investigation ended in practice, even if the archive remained active. The archive now functions as memory rather than inquiry. Memory preserves what was done. It does not ask what could have been done differently. This distinction matters, because memory is static, inquiry is not. The Lockerbie case lives on as memory, referenced in policy, cited in history, invoked as precedent. It no longer lives as a question. And yet, the questions persist. They persist quietly, in the margins of reports, in the footnotes of judgments, in the unanswered requests for disclosure. They persist because they were never resolved. They were set aside. This is not unique to Lockerbie. It is a pattern visible in investigations of enormous scale and consequence, when pressure is immense, when politics intersect with evidence, when time erodes certainty. In such cases, investigations do not always end with truth. They end with structure. Structure absorbs uncertainty and renders it manageable. The Lockerbie investigation achieved that. It restored order. It delivered an outcome. It allowed institutions to move forward. What it did not deliver was unanimity. And unanimity matters, not for blame, for trust. The final chapter of this story does not accuse, it observes. It observes how evidence can survive physically while losing influence, how archives can preserve information while restricting meaning, how investigations can be finished without being complete. The file on Lockerbie is closed. The archive remains. Within it lie fragments of certainty and fragments of doubt. They coexist. But coexistence is not resolution. Resolution requires engagement. And engagement ended when the system decided that no further movement was possible. That decision shaped everything that followed. The disappearance, then, was not an act. It was a process. A slow narrowing of focus, a gradual withdrawal of inquiry, a final acceptance that the case would stand as it was. Not because every question had been answered, but because answering them had become impossible within the system that asked them. That is what remains in the archive. Not silence, not proof, but a record of effort ending where certainty could no longer be sustained. And that, more than any single piece of missing evidence, is what defines the Lockerbie investigation. The Lockerbie case is closed. The archive is not complete. Investigations of this scale do not always end with certainty. Sometimes they end when further inquiry becomes impossible. Black archive documents what remains when evidence survives, but clarity does not. More files remain unresolved. More investigations reached conclusions without finishing. And this archive is still being written.